Hello friends, welcome back to another deep dive into history's darkest chapters. Today, we're exploring a topic that will make you grateful for every modern convenience you take for granted, while you absolutely wouldn't survive even 24 hours in a medieval. Before we begin this journey through one of humanity's most brutal eras, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. It brings me such joy to know that people from around the globe are here to learn about our shared, often horrifying past. Now, let's transport ourselves back to a time when life was truly nasty, brutish, and devastatingly short. Picture this: you wake up tomorrow, but instead of your comfortable mattress, you're lying on a pile of rotting straw that you share with your entire extended family and your livestock. The overwhelming stench hits you immediately, a nauseating cocktail of human excrement, animal waste, decaying food, and unwashed bodies that have never encountered soap. There's no bathroom, no running water, no electricity, and definitely no morning coffee to help you face the day ahead. Welcome to medieval life, where death lurked around every corner and survival was a daily miracle. You might think you're tough enough to handle it. After all, you've dealt with power outages, camping trips, maybe even some challenging living situations. But medieval life wasn't just uncomfortable, it was systematically designed to kill you through 1,000 different mechanisms that modern people can barely comprehend. Today, we're going to explore every aspect of medieval existence that would destroy you from the moment you opened your eyes until the moment you inevitably died, which would happen far sooner than you can imagine. We'll examine the diseases that would ravage your body, the laws that would execute you for crimes you didn't know existed, and the social systems that would crush your soul long before they finished off your physical form. But first, let's establish just how alien medieval life was compared to anything in your experience. The average medieval peasant, and remember, 85% of the population were peasants, worked 16 hours daily during harvest season, slept on moldy, parasite-infested straw, consumed the same monotonous gruel for months on end, and lived in constant terror of starvation, disease, violence, and death. They had absolutely no concept of privacy, personal hygiene, individual rights, or leisure time. The medieval mindset was fundamentally different from ours. People genuinely believed that disease was divine punishment or demonic possession. They were convinced the earth was flat and that celestial bodies controlled human destiny. They accepted that most children would perish before reaching adulthood and that women were inherently inferior creatures. They inhabited a world where superstition replaced science, where might determined right, and where suffering was considered humanity's natural state. Life expectancy statistics tell the horrifying story. If you were fortunate enough to survive birth, and roughly 30% of infants didn't, you could expect to live maybe 35 years as a peasant, or 45 if you were nobility. These numbers are actually misleading because they include devastating infant mortality rates. If you somehow made it to age 10, you might reach 50, but every single year would be filled with hardships that would shatter the spirit of any modern person. The medieval calendar wasn't marked by holidays or vacation time, but by cycles of planting and harvest, fasting and feast, epidemic and recovery. People measured their existence not in achievements or experiences, but in simple survival from one brutal season to the next. So prepare yourself, because we are about to journey through one of history's most dangerous periods, and by the end, you'll be kissing the ground of the 21st century. Chapter 1: Your medieval home, a death trap disguised as shelter. Let's begin with your living situation, though living is an optimistic term for what you'd experience. Your typical medieval peasant home was a single-room hovel constructed from whatever materials could be scrounged locally. In England, this meant wattle and daub, essentially a wooden skeleton packed with a mixture of mud, animal dung, and straw. The walls stood maybe 6 feet high, built by weaving thin branches between vertical posts, then coating the entire structure with a mixture that was equal parts clay, cow manure, and chopped straw. The roof was thatched with more straw, which might sound quaint until you realize it was an ideal breeding ground for rats, insects, and every conceivable parasite. The thatch needed to be at least a foot thick to provide any protection from rain, but it was never completely waterproof. During storms, water would constantly drip through, transforming the dirt floor into a muddy swamp. Speaking of that floor, there was no wooden planking, no stone tiles, no proper flooring whatsoever. Just packed earth, sometimes mixed with clay if you were incredibly fortunate. This dirt surface was covered with rushes or straw that served simultaneously as carpet, bedding, and garbage disposal system. These floor coverings were replaced perhaps once or twice yearly, creating a festering mat of rotting organic matter mixed with food scraps, animal waste, human bodily fluids, and everything else that fell or was spilled during daily activities. Archaeologists excavating medieval peasant homes have discovered floor layers containing chicken bones, fish scales, vegetable peelings, broken pottery, lost tools, children's toys, and yes, human feces, all compressed into layers that tell the story of medieval domestic life in the most revolting way imaginable. But here's where it gets truly delightful. You wouldn't live alone in this charming space. Your medieval home was shared with your entire extended family and your livestock. That's correct, your cows, pigs, chickens, and goats all resided in the same room as you and your children. A typical peasant cottage was divided into roughly 2 sections, about 2/3 for the human family and 1/3 for the animals, separated by nothing more than a low wooden fence or wattle barrier. The animals weren't temporary guests, they were permanent residents. During winter, having them indoors was essential for survival. Their body heat helped warm the space, and their valuable lives needed protection from thieves and predators. But this arrangement meant you constantly breathed animal dander, dealt with overwhelming odors from their waste, and shared your living space with all the diseases and parasites they carried. The medieval family unit was significantly larger than modern families. A typical household might include grandparents, parents, children, unmarried siblings, and various other relatives who had nowhere else to go. Add occasional guests or hired workers, and you might have 10 minutes 15 people crammed into roughly 400 square feet. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. Everything happened in full view of everyone else's birth, death, illness, intimate moments, arguments, celebrations, and daily bodily functions. Children grew up witnessing every aspect of adult life, including experiences that would be considered deeply traumatic by modern standards. Your only source of heat and light was a fire pit in a room center. Most peasant homes had no chimney, just a hole in the roof directly above the fire pit. This meant your house was constantly filled with smoke that burned your eyes, damaged your lungs, and covered everything in a layer of soot. The smoke was so dense that medieval people regularly suffered from serious respiratory problems and eye diseases directly caused by these smoky environments. Fire pits served multiple purposes: cooking, heating, and illumination. But maintaining a fire was an endless challenge. Fuel was expensive and difficult to obtain. Wood had to be gathered wherever possible, and during winter, families would sometimes burn furniture, tools, or even parts of their house structure to stay warm. Sleep meant carefully bunking the fire so it wouldn't extinguish completely, because starting a new fire was difficult and time-consuming. Lighting after dark was minimal and precious. Candles were expensive luxuries made from animal fat or beeswax. Most people used rushlights, dried reeds soaked in animal fat that burned for maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes. A typical family might use 1 or 2 rushlights per evening, providing just enough illumination to see immediate surroundings. Most activities ceased at sunset simply because adequate light didn't exist to continue. The absence of windows meant your home was incredibly dark during daytime and pitch black at night. The last was a luxury completely beyond common people's reach, so if any window openings existed at all, they were simply holes in walls that could be covered with oiled cloth, animal skins, or wooden shutters. These openings were typically small and few, since larger ones would admit rain, snow, and cold air. This perpetual dimness contributed to vitamin D deficiency and numerous health problems. Medieval people frequently suffered from rickets, bone deformities, and other conditions related to inadequate sunlight exposure. The psychological effects of living in constant twilight cannot be overstated. Depression and seasonal affective disorder were common, though completely misunderstood and untreated. Furniture was minimal and crudely constructed. You might possess a few 3-legged stools, a rough wooden table made from planks laid across supports, some storage chests or baskets, and basic cooking implements. Everything was handmade by family members or local craftsmen using simple tools. Comfort was never considered. Functionality and durability were the only priorities. Your bed was straw on the floor, shared with your entire family and possibly some smaller animals. The straw was infested with fleas, lice, and other parasites. Blankets were rough woolen cloth or animal skins that were heavy, scratchy, and rarely washed. Your pillow was a bundle of rags or a small sack stuffed with straw or feathers if you were extraordinarily fortunate. Sleep was fitful and constantly interrupted. Animals would make noise throughout the night. Family members would cough, snore, and move about. Children would cry. The fire needed tending. Fleas and lice would bite and crawl. The overwhelming smell was inescapable. Rain might drip through the roof. Cold drafts would blow through wall gaps. The structural integrity of these homes was questionable at best. Medieval building techniques were primitive, and materials were often green wood that warped and cracked as it dried. Foundations were minimal or non-existent. Walls could collapse without warning, especially during storms or after heavy rains. Roofs could cave in under snow weight or during high winds. Fire was a constant threat. The combination of open flames, dry thatch roofing, and wooden construction made house fires frequent and devastating. Many medieval people died in house fires, and entire neighborhoods could burn when flames spread from building to building. There were no fire departments, no suppression systems, and no building codes to prevent disasters. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of medieval homes was invisible: the microscopic threats. These houses were breeding grounds for bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungal infections. The combination of poor ventilation, animal waste, rotting organic matter, and overcrowded conditions created perfect environments for disease transmission. The floor rushes harbored countless pathogens. Walls were damp and moldy. Air was thick with dust, smoke, and airborne contaminants. Everything you touched was contaminated with germs that could cause serious illness or death. Water had to be carried from wells, streams, or public sources that were often contaminated. Storage was in wooden buckets or clay vessels that were extremely difficult to keep clean. Most families rationed water carefully, using it first for drinking and cooking, then for washing dishes, and finally for basic hygiene if any remained. Waste disposal was primitive and dangerous. Human waste was collected in chamber pots that were emptied into streets, ditches, or nearby fields. There was no sewage system, no garbage collection, and no understanding of how waste disposal affected health. The area around most medieval homes was contaminated with human and animal waste that created breeding grounds for disease. Food storage was a constant battle. Without refrigeration, everything required preservation through smoking, salting, drying, or fermentation. Root cellars dug into the ground provided some cool storage, but they were often damp and prone to flooding. Grain was stored in wooden chests or baskets, offering little protection from rodents and insects. Rats and mice were constant companions in medieval homes. They contaminated food supplies, spread diseases, and caused property damage. Cats were kept to control rodent populations, but even the best mouses couldn't completely eliminate the problem. Some families kept small dogs for the same purpose, but these animals added to overcrowding and sanitation problems. The psychological impact of living in such conditions was devastating. The constant stress of overcrowding, lack of comfort and privacy, ever-present smells and smoke, and knowledge that your home could collapse or burn at any moment created chronic anxiety and depression that shortened lives even beyond the physical health threats. For women, the home environment was particularly challenging. They spent most time indoors, exposed to smoke and poor air quality while cooking and managing household tasks. Pregnancy and childbirth in these unsanitary conditions led to high rates of infection and death for both mothers and babies. Your medieval home wasn't a sanctuary or place of comfort, it was a survival challenge that tested your endurance every single day. The very place meant to protect you from the outside world was slowly killing you from within. Chapter 2: Food and Famine, when your next meal could be your last. Now that we've established your home was essentially a death trap, let's discuss food, or more accurately, the desperate lack thereof. In medieval times, eating wasn't about pleasure or even adequate nutrition, it was about not dying of starvation. For most people, that was a daily challenge consuming their every waking moment. The medieval diet was monotonous, inadequate, and dangerous. For the average peasant, meals consisted mainly of bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables could be grown locally. Meat was a rare luxury reserved for special occasions, and even then it was often spoiled, diseased, or of questionable origin. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, comprising 7 to -80% of daily calories for most people. But this wasn't the fluffy, white bread you know. Medieval bread was made from whatever grain was available, wheat if you were incredibly fortunate and wealthy, but more often barley, oats, rye, or even beans and peas ground into flour. The bread was dark, coarse, dense, and frequently contaminated with dirt, insects, stones, and rodent droppings mixed in during growing, harvesting, and grinding processes. Bread quality varied dramatically based on social status and local conditions. The wealthy might obtain white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour, but peasants typically ate dark bread barely recognizable as bread by modern standards. Sometimes grain was so poor it was mixed with sawdust, crushed acorns, or even clay to extend supplies. Making bread was a complex and dangerous process. First, grain had to be ground into flour using stone mills that often left grit and stone particles in the flour. This debris wore down people's teeth and caused serious dental problems. The flour was then mixed with water to make dough, but the water was often contaminated and mixing bowls were rarely clean. Baking required access to an oven, which most peasant families didn't possess. In many villages, there was one communal oven owned by the manor lord. Peasants had to pay to use this oven and wait their turn, sometimes for days. During busy periods like harvest time, families might go without fresh bread for weeks. But here's the truly terrifying aspect: grain used for bread was often infected with ergot, a fungus-producing compound similar to LSD. Ergot contamination caused a condition called St. Anthony's fire, leading to hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and death. Entire communities would sometimes be poisoned by ergot-contaminated bread, resulting in outbreaks of madness, mass hysteria, and horrific deaths. Ergot poisoning symptoms were nightmarish. Victims experienced burning sensations in their extremities, followed by gangrene causing fingers, toes, hands, and feet to literally fall off. Others suffered convulsions so violent they broke their own bones. Many hallucinated terrifying visions before dying in agony. What made this even more horrifying was that people had no understanding of what caused these symptoms. They attributed ergot poisoning to witchcraft, divine punishment, or demonic possession. Communities would sometimes turn on each other, accusing neighbors of casting spells or making deals with the devil, when in reality they were all being slowly poisoned by their daily bread. Vegetables were limited to what could be grown locally and preserved without refrigeration. The medieval vegetable garden was nothing like modern produce sections. Cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, carrots, and beans were most common, but they were often small, tough, and bitter compared to modern varieties. These vegetables were typically stored in root cellars where they slowly rotted or became infested with insects and worms. By late winter and early spring, stored vegetables would be moldy, sprouted, or completely spoiled. People ate them anyway rather than starve, leading to frequent food poisoning and nutritional deficiencies. Fresh vegetables were only available during growing season, which was much shorter than in modern agricultural systems. For 6 months or more each year, people had to survive on whatever stored vegetables remained, often eating roots and leaves barely recognizable as food. Fruit was even rarer and more seasonal than vegetables. Most medieval people went their entire lives eating fresh fruit only a few times. Apples and pears could be stored for a few months in cool conditions, but they quickly became soft and rotten. Other fruits like berries had to be eaten immediately when ripe or preserved by drying, which removed most nutritional value. Food preservation was a constant struggle against time and decay. Without refrigeration, meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried, processes that didn't always work perfectly and often made meat nearly inedible. Salt was expensive and often contained impurities that added strange flavors and colors to preserved foods. Smoking meat required constant attention to maintain proper temperature and smoke density. Too little smoke meant spoilage. Too much heat cooked rather than preserved. The process could take days or weeks, and there was always risk that something would go wrong and entire supplies would be lost. Salted meat was incredibly tough and salty, requiring hours of soaking before consumption. Even then, it was often so hard it had to be ground up or boiled into mush. Salt used for preservation was often contaminated with sand, dirt, and other impurities, adding to unpleasant texture and taste. But the real horror of medieval eating wasn't just poor food quality, it was the constant threat of famine. Crop failures due to bad weather, plant diseases, or insect infestations could mean starvation for entire regions. The Great Famine of 1350–1322 killed between 10–25% of Northern Europe's population. People literally starved to death in streets while others watched helplessly. This famine's psychological impact was devastating. Contemporary chronicles describe people eating bark from trees, grass from fields and leather from shoes and belts. Some resorted to eating clay, hoping it would fill their stomachs despite providing no nutrition. Others turned to eating non-food items, sawdust, animal droppings, even poisonous plants they knew might kill them but hoped might provide sustenance. During the worst famines, cannibalism became documented reality. Parents faced unthinkable choices about which children to feed and which to abandon. Some families sent their weakest members away to die alone rather than watch them starve slowly. Markets sold human flesh alongside what little animal meat was available. Social breakdown during famines was complete and terrifying. Normal moral codes disappeared when people were dying of hunger. Food theft became punishable by immediate execution, but people still risked death to steal a single loaf of bread. Children were abandoned by parents who couldn't feed them. The elderly were left to die so younger family members might survive. Even in normal years, famine threat was never distant. Medieval agriculture was primitive and unreliable. A single hailstorm could destroy an entire year's crop. Too much rain caused grain to rot in fields. Too little rain caused drought and crop failure. Insect swarms could devour entire harvests in days. There was no way to predict or prevent these agricultural disasters, and no way to import food from distant regions when local crops failed. Communities were entirely dependent on what they could grow themselves, and when that failed, they faced starvation with no hope of relief. Food preparation was almost as dangerous as finding it. Cooking was done over open fires using crude utensils made of wood or poorly forged metal. Burns were common and often serious. House fires started by cooking accidents killed thousands annually. Cooking pots made of clay could crack and spill boiling liquids, causing severe injuries. Food storage was primitive and ineffective. Grain was kept in wooden containers, offering little protection from rodents, insects, and moisture. Rats and mice contaminated food supplies with their droppings and urine, spreading diseases like plague. Weevils and other insects infested stored grain, making it barely edible even when it didn't cause illness. The seasonal nature of food availability created a yearly cycle of plenty and want dominating medieval life. Even in good years, the period between winter food stores ending and new harvest, called the Hunger Gap, was a time of severe shortages. People would lose significant weight during these periods, and many died from malnutrition-related diseases. Lack of nutritional understanding meant that even when food was available, people's diets were severely imbalanced. Protein deficiency was common, leading to kwashiorkor, muscle wasting, and developmental problems in children. Iron deficiency caused anemia, making people weak and susceptible to other illnesses. Vitamin deficiencies led to scurvy, rickets, and other diseases easily preventable with modern nutrition. Children suffered most from poor nutrition. Many were permanently stunted by malnutrition, never reaching full growth potential. Pregnant and nursing mothers often couldn't get adequate nutrition, leading to high rates of infant and maternal mortality. Children who survived infancy often bore physical and cognitive effects of chronic malnutrition throughout their lives. Water was often contaminated and dangerous to drink. People knew certain water sources made them sick but didn't understand why or how to make it safe. Wells were often contaminated by human waste, animal carcasses, and other pollutants. Rivers and streams served as both water sources and sewage disposal systems. The alcoholic beverages people drank instead of water were low in alcohol but contained enough ethanol to kill some bacteria. However, these drinks were often made from contaminated ingredients and could cause their own health problems. Brewing was unsanitary and storage conditions allowed harmful organisms to multiply. Beer and ale were often the only safe liquids available, so even children drank them regularly. This meant entire populations lived in mild but constant intoxication, affecting their ability to work, think clearly, and make good decisions. Alcohol-related accidents, violence, and health problems were common consequences. Your relationship with food in medieval times would be fundamentally different from today. Food was scarce, precious, and never taken for granted. Every meal could be your last, and every bite was a victory against starvation. This created a relationship with food based on desperation rather than pleasure, a constant reminder that you were always just one crop failure away from death. Chapter 3: Disease and Medicine, where cures were more deadly than the diseases. If somehow your hovel didn't kill you and starvation didn't claim you, don't worry, medieval medicine was standing by to finish the job. Welcome to an era where doctors believed that bad odors could cure disease, where surgery was performed with the same tools used to butcher animals, and where the treatment was almost guaranteed to be more lethal than whatever was actually wrong with you. Life expectancy in medieval times was brutally short, with disease serving as the primary executioner. If you managed to survive the dangerous process of being born, and roughly 30% of babies you could expect to live perhaps 35 years if you were a peasant, maybe 45 if you were fortunate enough to be born into nobility. The concept of retirement, of gracefully aging, of watching grandchildren grow up, these were fantasies beyond medieval imagination. Disease was everywhere, and it was remarkably creative in its methods of destroying you. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, eliminated between 30 and 60% of the population in many regions. But plague was merely one assassin in an army of killers that stalked medieval communities daily. Tuberculosis, which medieval people called consumption, was perhaps the most feared disease because of its slow, agonizing method of killing. The disease would gradually waste away its victims over months or years, causing them to cough up increasing amounts of blood while losing dramatic amounts of weight before eventually dying in excruciating pain. The disease spread easily through the overcrowded, poorly ventilated living conditions we described earlier. Entire families would be systematically wiped out as tuberculosis passed from person to person in their cramped homes. Children would watch their parents slowly waste away, fully understanding they would likely be next. The psychological trauma of living with consumption was nearly as devastating as the physical symptoms, creating a constant atmosphere of dread and hopelessness. Medieval understanding of tuberculosis was not only completely wrong but actively harmful. Doctors believed the disease was caused by corrupted air or evil vapors, leading to treatments that made patients significantly worse. They would prescribe bloodletting to weaken already fragile patients, or recommend exposure to good air that often meant sitting in cold, damp conditions that accelerated the disease's deadly progress. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and the appalling sanitation we've discussed, killed through violent diarrhea and rapid dehydration. The disease was so commonplace that medieval people accepted it as a normal part of existence, like catching a seasonal cold. But dysentery could kill within days, particularly children and elderly people whose bodies couldn't withstand the severe fluid loss. The constant presence of human waste in streets and water sources meant dysentery epidemics swept through communities with terrifying regularity. During outbreaks, entire households would be struck down simultaneously, leaving nobody healthy enough to care for the sick. People would die of dehydration while lying in their own waste, too weak to call for help that probably wouldn't have arrived anyway. Medieval treatments for dysentery were not merely useless, but frequently fatal. Doctors would prescribe additional bloodletting to drain the corrupted humors, or administer powerful purgatives that caused even more catastrophic fluid loss. Some physicians recommended drinking wine mixed with crushed pearls or gold dust, expensive remedies that accomplished nothing except bankrupting families while their loved ones died horrible deaths. Typhus, spread by the lice and fleas that infested everyone due to poor hygiene, thrived in medieval living conditions. The disease caused extremely high fevers, severe headaches, and characteristic rashes before killing victims through organ failure. Since personal cleanliness was virtually non-existent and people rarely washed their clothes or bedding, everyone harbored the insects that transmitted this killer. Medieval response to typhus outbreaks was to dramatically increase religious observances, believing God was punishing the community for collective sins. This meant organizing more crowded church services where the disease could spread even faster among the faithful. Some communities organized mass processions where hundreds of infected people would march through streets, spreading lice and disease to everyone they encountered. Typhus was particularly devastating during wartime, when soldiers lived in extremely close quarters under terrible conditions. Entire armies would be decimated by typhus outbreaks, often losing more men to disease than to enemy weapons. The disease earned the nickname war fever because it seemed to follow military campaigns across Europe like a deadly shadow. Smallpox survivors were left horribly scarred and frequently blind. The disease was highly contagious with a mortality rate around 30%. Those fortunate enough to survive were marked for life with deep pockmarks that made them instantly recognizable as smallpox survivors. These scars weren't merely cosmetic, they often indicated underlying tissue damage that caused ongoing health problems. Medieval people believed smallpox was caused by corrupt blood and attempted treatment by making small cuts in patients' skin to release the bad blood. This practice, called scarification, often led to secondary infections that killed patients who might have survived the original disease. The cure, once again, proved deadlier than the illness. Social stigma attached to smallpox survivors was severe and lasting. Many people believed the facial scars indicated moral corruption or divine displeasure. Survivors often found it impossible to marry or find employment, leading to lives of poverty and social isolation that compounded the trauma of surviving the disease in the first place. But epidemic diseases weren't the only killers. Ordinary infections that we treat effortlessly today were automatic death sentences. A simple cut from a farming implement could become infected and lead to sepsis and death within days. Broken bones that didn't heal properly could cause lifelong disability or fatal complications when fragments pierce internal organs. Medieval understanding of infection was non-existent. People had absolutely no concept of germs or bacteria, so they had no comprehension of why wounds sometimes festered and killed. They would routinely pack infected wounds with materials that made infections dramatically worse: animal dung, spider webs, moldy bread, and other substances that introduced additional harmful bacteria into open wounds. Some medieval treatments for infected wounds were so catastrophically harmful they virtually guaranteed death. Physicians would cauterize wounds with red-hot irons, destroying healthy tissue along with infected areas. Others would apply caustic substances like quicklime or acid that burned away flesh and bone. Many patients died from shock and trauma caused by these treatments rather than from their original injuries. Childbirth was extraordinarily dangerous for women, with maternal mortality rates that would horrify modern sensibilities. Without understanding of sterile technique, basic anatomy, or the mechanics of labor and delivery, midwives often cause more harm than good. Conservative estimates suggest that 10–20% of all women died in childbirth, making pregnancy a potentially fatal condition for half the population. Medieval obstetric practices were based entirely on superstition rather than medical knowledge. Midwives would place religious relics on laboring women, administer toxic herbal concoctions, or perform dangerous procedures that dramatically increased risks of infection and death. Breech births, prolonged labor, and other complications that are manageable today were automatic death sentences for both mother and child. The social implications of maternal mortality were devastating beyond the immediate tragedy. Children who lost mothers in infancy had minimal chances of survival, as there were no adequate substitutes for breast milk. Families were shattered by maternal death, and communities lost their most productive members during their peak childbearing years, creating cascading social and economic problems. Infant mortality was even worse than maternal mortality. Approximately half of all children died before their 5th birthday, with many more perishing before reaching adulthood. The causes were numerous and largely preventable by modern standards: birth trauma, infections, congenital defects that would be easily treatable today, accidents, malnutrition, and simple neglect. Many babies were accidentally smothered while sleeping with parents in overcrowded beds, a practice called overlaying that was so common it had established legal categories. Parents would wake to find their infants dead, crushed beneath adult weight during sleep. This tragedy was repeated thousands of times annually across medieval Europe, adding to the already staggering infant death toll. Medieval medical knowledge was a lethal mixture of ancient Greek theories, religious superstition, and folk remedies that were consistently more harmful than helpful. The dominant medical theory was based on the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed illness resulted from imbalances of these humors, designing treatments to restore balance through methods that routinely killed patients. Bloodletting was the most common medical procedure, used to treat everything from headaches to plague. Doctors would cut veins or apply leeches to drain excess blood from patients, often weakening them so severely they died from blood loss rather than their original ailment. The amount of blood removed was sometimes enormous, up to half a patient's total blood volume in severe cases. The tools used for bloodletting were crude and completely unsanitary. Knives, razors, and sharpened metal implements would be used on multiple patients without any cleaning or sterilization between uses. This practice spread diseases like hepatitis and syphilis from patient to patient, creating epidemics of blood-borne illnesses that physicians couldn't understand or prevent. Purging, forcing patients to vomit or have diarrhea, was another standard treatment. Doctors would give patients toxic substances like mercury, antimony, or plant extracts that caused violent illness. The theory was that vomiting and diarrhea would expel disease from the body, but in reality, these treatments often caused dehydration, poisoning, and death. The substances used for purging were often more dangerous than the diseases they were meant to treat. Mercury caused neurological damage, kidney failure, and death. Antimony was a poison that could kill in small doses. Many plant extracts used as purgatives contained toxic alkaloids that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and organ failure. Surgery, when it was attempted at all, was performed without anesthesia, antiseptic technique, or proper anatomical knowledge. Surgeons, who were often the same people who cut hair and pulled teeth, would use unsterilized instruments in filthy conditions. The mortality rate for surgical procedures was close to 100%. Medieval surgical tools were crude and multifunctional. The same knife might be used to cut hair, trim fingernails, and perform surgery. Saws used for carpentry were employed to amputate limbs. Needles used for sewing clothes were used to suture wounds. None of these tools were designed for medical use, and none were properly sterilized. The medieval period represents one of the darkest chapters in medical history, where ignorance and superstition created a healthcare system that was more likely to kill than cure. But this medical nightmare was just one aspect of a society designed to destroy human life and dignity at every turn. Chapter 4, Laws and Justice, where justice was anything but just. Think modern legal systems are unfair? Medieval law would make you long for the good old days of parking tickets and jury duty. Welcome to a world where you could be executed for stealing a loaf of bread, where your guilt or innocence was determined by whether you sank when thrown into water, and where the punishment for most crimes was designed to be as publicly humiliating and painful as possible. Medieval legal systems vary by region, but they all shared certain characteristics that would terrify any modern person who values due process or human rights. The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. Justice was swift, brutal, and often completely arbitrary, based more on social status, personal relationships, and the whims of local authorities than on any consistent application of legal principles. Let's start with some of the bizarre laws that could get you killed. In medieval England, it was illegal for peasants to wear certain colors or types of clothing. Purple and ermine were reserved for royalty, and wearing them if you weren't noble could result in severe punishment, including death. These sumptuary laws were incredibly detailed, specifying exactly what fabrics, colors, and styles each social class was permitted to wear. The enforcement of clothing laws was arbitrary and often corrupt. A peasant might wear a piece of fine clothing given to them by an employer or found second-hand, only to be arrested and punished for dressing above their station. Local officials could use these laws to harass people they disliked or to extort bribes from anyone whose clothing seemed too fine for their social position. Similarly, there were laws governing what foods different social classes were allowed to eat. A peasant caught eating swan, venison, or other noble foods could face harsh penalties, including mutilation or death. These dietary restrictions weren't just about luxury, they extended to basic nutrition, with laws limiting how much meat, white bread, and other quality foods peasants could consume. Poaching hunting animals on someone else's land was punishable by death, and this wasn't just talking about hunting royal deer in the king's forests. Even catching rabbits, birds, or fish on land that didn't belong to you could result in execution. The wealthy landowners had exclusive rights to all wildlife on their property, and they enforced these rights with deadly seriousness. The definition of poaching was so broad that it included almost any interaction with wildlife. Setting snares for rabbits, collecting eggs from wild birds, or even gathering nuts and berries could be considered poaching if done on someone else's land. Given that most peasants had no land of their own and lived surrounded by property belonging to nobles, it was almost impossible to supplement their meager diets without technically committing capital crimes. Vagrancy was another serious crime that could result in death. If you couldn't prove you had a job or a permanent home, you could be arrested, whipped, branded, mutilated, or executed. The authorities were so paranoid about unemployed people that they created harsh laws to force everyone into some form of labor, no matter how degrading or poorly paid. Religious crimes were particularly severe, reflecting the enormous power of the Catholic Church in medieval society. Heresy, having religious beliefs that differed from official church doctrine, was punishable by being burned alive at the stake. but the definition of heresy was so broad that almost any deviation from orthodox belief could be fatal. The methods of determining guilt or innocence were medieval in the worst possible way. Trial by ordeal was based on the belief that God would intervene to protect the innocent, but the ordeals were designed in ways that made survival unlikely regardless of guilt or innocence. Trial by fire required the accused to carry a red-hot iron bar for a specified distance, usually 9 paces, or walk barefoot across burning coals. The burns were then bandaged and examined 3 days later. If the wounds appeared to be healing cleanly, the person was declared innocent. If infection had set in, which was almost inevitable given medieval understanding of wound care, they were declared guilty and executed. Trial by water came in 2 varieties, both potentially fatal. In cold water ordeal, the accused was bound hand and foot and thrown into a body of water. If they sank, they were considered innocent and usually drowned in the process. If they floated, they were guilty of witchcraft and would be executed, often by burning. The punishments for crimes were designed to be as public and humiliating as possible. Public execution was common entertainment, with entire communities gathering to watch criminals die in various horrible ways. These events were often treated as festivals, with vendors selling food and drink to the crowds. Hanging was the most common form of execution, but medieval executioners often lacked the knowledge to perform it quickly and humanely. Without proper technique, victims could strangle slowly for minutes rather than dying quickly from a broken neck. Drawing and quartering was reserved for the most serious crimes, particularly treason. The victim would first be dragged through the streets behind a horse, then hanged until nearly dead, cut down while still alive, and disemboweled. Finally, they would be cut into quarters, with different body parts displayed in various locations as warnings to others. For lesser crimes, punishments included public whipping, time in the stocks or pillory, branding with hot irons, and various forms of mutilation. These penalties were designed to mark criminals permanently, making it impossible for them to escape their past or integrate into new communities. The medieval legal system was designed to maintain social order through fear rather than justice. For the average person living in medieval times, the legal system was not a source of protection but a constant threat. Any minor infraction could result in torture, mutilation, or death. Chapter 5: The Social Hierarchy, or Place in the Human Pecking Order. Medieval society wasn't just unfair, it was systematically designed to crush the hopes, dreams, and lives of the vast majority of people while concentrating all power, wealth, and opportunity in the hands of a tiny elite. If you were born a peasant, you would die a peasant, and your children and grandchildren would suffer the same fate for generations to come. The feudal system was essentially a pyramid of oppression, with the king at the top, followed by nobles, knights, clergy, and at the bottom, where 85–90% of the population lived, the peasants, serfs, and villeins who did all the actual work while receiving almost none of the benefits. As a serf, not quite a slave, but the distinction was meaningless. In practical terms, you were legally bound to the land where you were born. This meant you could never leave without your lord's permission that was rarely granted and usually came with conditions that made freedom impossible to achieve. You didn't own the land you worked, the house you lived in, or even the tools you used for farming. Everything belonged to your lord, including the right to control where you lived, what work you did, whom you could marry, and even where you could go to church. The work expected of you was back-breaking and never-ending. You owed your lord a certain number of days of labor each week, typically 3 days out of 7, but this could increase to 6 or 7 days during busy periods like planting and harvest. These weren't regular 8-hour workdays, either. You worked from dawn to dusk, often 12–16 hours a day during busy seasons. The taxes and obligations you owed were crushing and seemingly endless. In addition to your labor, you owed a portion of everything you produced. The church demanded its share too, in the form of tithes, another 10% of your production. By the time you paid all your obligations, you were left with maybe 30–40% of what you produced if you were lucky. Marriage required your lord's permission, and he could refuse for any reason or no reason at all. Your children belonged to your lord as much as they belonged to you. They were bound to the same land and the same servitude from the moment they were born. Education was forbidden to serfs in many places and actively discouraged everywhere. Learning to read and write was considered above your station and potentially dangerous to the social order. Legal rights for serfs were minimal or non-existent. Your lord could punish you for infractions both real and imagined, and there was little recourse to higher authorities. You couldn't testify against your lord in court, and your word carried no weight against that of any free person. Moving up in the social hierarchy was virtually impossible. Even becoming a free peasant required your lord's permission, and usually a substantial payment that most serfs could never afford. The system was designed to be self-perpetuating and nearly impossible to escape. The psychological impact was devastating. Serfs lived with a constant knowledge that they had no control over their own lives, no hope for improvement, and no way to protect themselves or their families from the whims of their social superiors. Women faced additional restrictions at every level of society. A peasant woman had fewer legal rights than a peasant man, couldn't inherit property in her own name in most places, and was legally subordinate to her father, husband, or nearest male relative throughout her life. The medieval social hierarchy was a system of systematic oppression that successfully maintained extreme inequality for centuries through a combination of violence, propaganda, and structural constraints that made escape nearly impossible. Chapter 6: Women's Lives when half the population had no rights. If you thought being a peasant man in medieval times was hard, try being a woman. Medieval society treated women not as human beings with rights and dignity, but as property to be owned, controlled, and disposed of according to the wishes of the men who had power over them. Let's start with birth, assuming you survived it. Female infanticide wasn't officially sanctioned in medieval Europe, but it happened frequently enough that demographic records show suspiciously high infant mortality rates among girls compared to boys. If you survived infancy as a girl, your childhood was drastically different from that of your brothers. While boys might have opportunities for education or advancement, girls were prepared for only one role, wife and mother. Marriage wasn't something that happened to you as a medieval woman, it was something that was done to you by the men who controlled your life. Medieval marriages were business transactions arranged by fathers to benefit their families economically, politically, or socially. Your wishes, feelings, and preferences were not just irrelevant, they were actively discouraged. The age of marriage for girls was shockingly young by modern standards. While canon law theoretically set the minimum age at 12, many girls were betrothed or married even younger. Your father could legally promise you in marriage before you could walk or talk, and you would have no legal right to refuse the arrangement. Once married, you legally ceased to exist as an independent person under the doctrine of coverture. Everything you had brought to the marriage became his property, and everything you earned or inherited thereafter also belonged to him. Your primary value as a married woman was your ability to produce male heirs. This reduced you to essentially a breeding machine whose worth was measured by your fertility and your success in producing sons. Pregnancy in medieval times was dangerous and frequent. Without reliable birth control methods, married women were pregnant almost continuously throughout their childbearing years. Maternal mortality rates were astronomical, with estimates suggesting that 10–20% of all women died in childbirth. If you survived childbirth, you faced the constant heartbreak of infant mortality. Roughly half of all children died before their 5th birthday, and as a mother, you would likely bury several of your babies during your lifetime. Domestic violence was not just tolerated in medieval society, but legally sanctioned and socially expected. Your husband had the legal right to discipline you physically, and the law provided specific guidelines for acceptable levels of violence. Economic dependence made escape from abusive marriages impossible for most women. Since you couldn't own property, earn independent income, or support yourself legally, leaving an abusive husband meant facing starvation, homelessness, and social ostracism. Divorce was virtually impossible for women under medieval law and religious doctrine. Women had almost no grounds for ending a marriage, even in cases of extreme physical abuse. Women's sexuality was heavily controlled and policed by both legal and social mechanisms. Female chastity was seen as essential to social order, and any deviation from strict sexual norms could result in severe punishment or death. Women accused of witchcraft faced almost certain death, as the legal procedures for determining guilt were designed to make conviction inevitable. The witch-hunting craze was fundamentally about controlling women who didn't conform to social expectations. Women's economic opportunities were severely limited and generally poorly compensated. The guild system generally excluded women from membership, preventing them from practicing most skilled trades or advancing to positions of economic independence. The life of a medieval woman was one of constant danger, legal disability, economic dependence, and social subordination. The medieval period represents one of the most systematically misogynistic eras in human history. Chapter 7: Crime and Violence when Death Lurked Around Every Corner. Medieval society was incredibly violent, and we're not just talking about the occasional bar fight or domestic dispute. Violence was so endemic to daily life that the average person lived in constant fear of assault, robbery, murder, or worse. Let's start with simple theft, which was punishable by death in most medieval jurisdictions. The definition was so broad that almost any economic activity could be construed as theft by corrupt authorities looking for excuses to eliminate inconvenient people. Taking food from someone else's field, even if you were starving, was theft punishable by hanging. The penalties were brutal and disproportionate. For stealing anything worth more than a few pence, you could be hanged, drawn and quartered, or subjected to other forms of execution designed to maximize suffering. False accusations of theft were common and often impossible to disprove. If a wealthy landowner claimed you had stolen from him, a word as a peasant carried no weight against his testimony. You could be executed based on nothing more than an accusation. Highway robbery was a constant threat for anyone who traveled. Medieval roads were dangerous places where bandits operated with virtual impunity. The isolation of medieval roads made them perfect hunting grounds for criminals. Urban violence was even worse than rural banditry. Medieval cities were crowded, poorly lit, and filled with desperate people competing for limited resources. Street violence was constant, and murder rates in medieval cities were 20 times higher than in modern urban areas. The narrow streets created countless opportunities for ambushes and attacks. The lack of street lighting meant most areas were pitch black after sunset, providing perfect cover for violent crimes. Weapons were commonly carried by most men, as personal protection was a necessity. Minor disputes could escalate to deadly confrontations within seconds, and the widespread availability of weapons made every argument potentially fatal. The concept of professional policing didn't exist in most medieval cities. Law enforcement was the responsibility of part-time watchmen and corrupt officials who were often criminals themselves. The justice system's reliance on brutal public punishment created a culture that celebrated and normalized extreme violence. Public executions were community entertainment events that drew large crowds of men, women, and children. Private vendettas and blood feuds were common and often lasted for generations, creating cycles of violence that could devastate entire communities. Domestic violence wasn't just tolerated, it was legally sanctioned and socially expected. Sexual violence was endemic and rarely punished, reflecting the low value placed on women's lives and bodily autonomy. The prevalence of alcohol made violence even more common and dangerous. Military violence spilled over into civilian life constantly, as professional soldiers often turned to banditry when not engaged in formal warfare. Religious violence was common and officially sanctioned by church and secular authorities. The constant threat of violence shaped every aspect of medieval life. People planned their daily activities around avoiding dangerous areas and situations. The normalization of violence created a society where cruelty was not just accepted but expected and celebrated. In this environment, every day was a potential life or death struggle. Murder rates in medieval cities were 50 times higher than in modern developed countries. The average medieval person witnessed more violence in a year than most modern people see in their entire lifetimes. Chapter 8: Travel and Transportation. Every journey could be your last. In our modern world, we complain about flight delays and traffic jams. In medieval times, travel was so dangerous that many people never ventured more than 5 miles from where they were born. Every journey, no matter how short, was potentially fatal and required careful planning, adequate resources, and considerable luck to complete successfully. Most medieval roads were nothing more than dirt tracks that had been worn down by foot traffic and wagon wheels over centuries. During dry weather, these paths were dusty, rutted, and filled with holes that could break a horse's leg. During wet weather, they became impassable quagmires of mud. Road maintenance was the responsibility of local communities, but peasants were too busy trying to survive to spend time on infrastructure that primarily benefited travelers from elsewhere. The result was a transportation network that deteriorated steadily throughout the medieval period. Bridges were rare and often in terrible condition. Most rivers had to be crossed at fords, which were dangerous during high water and sometimes impossible to locate. Many travelers drowned attempting river crossings, including Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa during the Third Crusade. Navigation was primitive and unreliable. There were no accurate maps available to ordinary people. Travelers relied on verbal directions from locals who might be mistaken malicious or simply trying to direct traffic away from their communities. Getting lost was easy and potentially fatal. Without landmarks or reliable directions, travelers could wander for days in unfamiliar territory. During winter, getting lost meant almost certain death from exposure. The speed of travel was painfully slow by modern standards. A person on foot could cover maybe 50 minutes, 20 miles per day under ideal conditions. On horseback, you might manage 25 minutes, 30 miles if you had a good horse and favorable terrain. But these were best-case scenarios that rarely occurred. Horses were expensive to buy and maintain, putting them beyond the reach of most ordinary people. A good traveling horse cost as much as a modern car and required daily care that added significantly to travel expenses. Accommodation for travelers was scarce and dangerous. Inns were often no better than the hovels that local peasants lived in. You might share a bed with strangers, including people with infectious diseases. Many inns were actually fronts for criminal operations. Weather was an implacable enemy of medieval travelers. Rain could make roads impassable and destroy supplies. Snow could bury roads entirely and make navigation impossible. Winter travel was particularly dangerous and often impossible. Food and water procurement during travel was always problematic. Water sources were often contaminated, and there was no reliable way to purify water to make it safe to drink. Many travelers died from dysentery and other waterborne diseases contracted during their journeys. Legal problems could arise in different jurisdictions along travel routes. Laws varied dramatically from one region to another, and travelers might unknowingly break local ordinances that carried severe penalties. Women traveling alone faced additional dangers, including sexual assault and accusations of improper behavior. Most women couldn't travel without male escorts, which meant they were dependent on men who might themselves be dangerous. Sea travel was faster than overland routes, but much more dangerous. Medieval ships were small, poorly constructed, and vulnerable to storms that could sink them without warning. Many ships were lost at sea without any trace. Even successful journeys took enormous tolls on travelers' health and resources. The physical exertion, poor nutrition, exposure to weather, and constant stress left many people permanently weakened or damaged. Communication during travel was nearly impossible. If something went wrong, there was no way to send word to family about delays or problems. The unpredictability of travel made planning almost impossible. For most medieval people, the dangers of travel far outweighed any potential benefits. Only the wealthy, desperate, or foolhardy attempted long journeys with any regularity. The vast majority of the population lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. Chapter 9: The Plague and Epidemics when Death Came for Entire Civilizations. No discussion of medieval horrors would be complete without examining the single most catastrophic event of the period, the Black Death. This pandemic, which swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killed between 75 and 200 million people, roughly 30–60% of Europe's population. That the Black Death was just the most famous of many epidemics that regularly devastated medieval populations. The plague arrived in Europe via trade routes from Asia, carried by fleas that lived on black rats aboard merchant ships. The disease came in three forms: bubonic plague, which caused massive swelling of lymph nodes called buboes, pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs, and septicemic plague, which infected the bloodstream. All three were usually fatal. Medieval people had no understanding of how diseases spread, so their attempts to combat the plague were not only useless but often made the situation worse. Many believed the plague was caused by miasma poisonous air, so they burned aromatic woods and herbs, creating smoke that actually helped spread airborne pathogens. Others thought it was divine punishment for sin, leading to religious processions that brought infected and healthy people together in large crowds. The symptoms of plague were horrifying and unmistakable. Bubonic plague began with sudden fever and chills, followed by the appearance of buboes, swollen lymph nodes the size of apples or eggs, usually in the groin, armpits, or neck. These buboes were excruciatingly painful and often burst, releasing pus and blood. The skin around them turned black, giving the disease its popular name. Victims suffered from severe headaches, muscle aches, and delirium. Many developed dark patches on their skin as blood vessels burst beneath the surface. The pneumonic form caused victims to cough up blood and struggle to breathe as their lungs filled with fluid. Most died within 3 to 7 days of showing symptoms. The social and psychological impact of the plague was as devastating as its physical effects. Entire families were wiped out within days. Children watched their parents die horrible deaths, knowing they would likely be next. Parents had to choose which children to care for when multiple family members fell ill simultaneously. Normal social structures collapsed completely in plague-stricken areas. There weren't enough healthy people to bury the dead, so bodies piled up in streets and houses, creating additional health hazards. Many churches and monasteries lost their entire populations, including the clergy who were supposed to provide spiritual comfort to the dying. The economic disruption was catastrophic. Entire villages were abandoned as their populations died. Agricultural production collapsed when there weren't enough surviving workers to tend crops or harvest them. Trade routes were disrupted as merchants and travelers died or refused to risk exposure to the disease. Some communities turned to scapegoating as a way to cope with the inexplicable disaster. Jews were particularly targeted, accused of poisoning wells or conspiring with the devil to spread the plague. Entire Jewish communities were massacred by mobs looking for someone to blame for their suffering. The plague also triggered extremist religious movements. Groups of flagellants traveled from town to town, wiping themselves bloody in public displays of penance, believing that their suffering would appease God's wrath. These processions actually helped spread the disease as infected flagellants moved from community to community. Medical responses to the plague were not only ineffective, but often accelerated death. Physicians still believed in the theory of humors and prescribed bloodletting for plague victims, weakening patients who desperately needed their strength to fight the infection. They also recommended purging and induced vomiting, causing additional fluid loss in patients who were already dehydrated from fever. Some doctors wore elaborate protective costumes that included leather robes, gloves, boots, and distinctive beak-shaped masks filled with aromatic herbs. While these outfits may have provided some protection from fleas, they were based on the incorrect belief that plague was spread through bad air rather than by actual contact with infected animals or people. The plague's impact on art, literature, and culture was profound. The constant presence of death led to a genre of art called memento mori, reminders of mortality, that appeared in paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts. The famous dance of death imagery showed skeletons leading people of all social classes to their graves, reflecting the plague's indiscriminate killing. But the Black Death was not the only epidemic disease that terrorized medieval populations. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery, and influenza regularly swept through communities, killing thousands and weakening survivors for future outbreaks. Leprosy was another feared disease that, while less immediately fatal than plague, caused horrible disfigurement and social ostracism. People with leprosy were required to ring bells to warn others of their approach and were often forced to live in isolated colonies outside town walls. Ergotism, caused by eating grain infected with ergot fungus, created outbreaks of madness, hallucinations, and gangrene. Entire communities would sometimes experience collective symptoms that were attributed to witchcraft or demonic possession, leading to panic and violence. The frequency of epidemics meant that medieval people lived with constant fear of disease. Parents knew that most of their children would die young. Communities developed fatalistic attitudes toward illness and death, seeing epidemic disease as an unavoidable part of life rather than something that could be prevented or treated. The cumulative effect of repeated epidemics was a population that was constantly weakened by malnutrition, previous illnesses, and poor living conditions. This made people more susceptible to new diseases and less likely to survive when they became infected. Recovery from major epidemics could take generations, as communities had to rebuild their populations, restore agricultural production, and re-establish trade networks. Some areas never fully recovered, remaining depopulated and economically marginal for centuries after major plague outbreaks. Chapter 10: War and Conflict when Violence was the Ultimate Arbiter. Medieval Europe was almost constantly at war. Between major conflicts, there were smaller wars, raids, sieges, and various other forms of organized violence that made peaceful life nearly impossible. War wasn't an occasional disruption to normal life, it was a constant background reality that shaped every aspect of medieval society. The causes of medieval warfare were numerous and often petty by modern standards. Kings fought over inheritance claims, territorial disputes, trade routes, and personal insults. Nobles waged private wars against their neighbors over everything from property boundaries to romantic rivalries. Religious differences provided justification for crusades, inquisitions, and holy wars that devastated entire regions. The conduct of medieval warfare was brutal beyond modern comprehension. There were no Geneva Conventions, no rules of engagement, and no protection for civilians. Armies routinely targeted non-combatants, burned crops, destroyed villages, and slaughtered anyone who got in their way. Siege warfare was particularly horrific. Cities under siege faced starvation as food supplies dwindled. Attackers would catapult diseased animal carcasses over walls to spread plague and other diseases. When cities finally fell, the victorious armies often massacred the entire population, including women, children, and elderly people who had nothing to do with the conflict. The weapons of medieval warfare were designed to cause maximum damage and suffering. Swords, axes, maces, and other hand weapons could hack limbs off or crush skulls. Crossbow bolts and arrows could pierce armor and pin victims to walls or ground. Later innovations like early cannons and firearms added new dimensions of terror to medieval battlefields. Professional soldiers were often little better than organized bandits. They were expected to live off the land, which meant stealing food, animals, and other supplies from the civilian population they encountered. When armies passed through an area, they left behind a trail of burned villages, slaughtered livestock, and traumatized survivors. The feudal system made every lord a potential warlord with his own private army. Knights and men-at-arms owed military service to their overlords, creating a web of military obligations that could drag entire regions into conflict when disputes arose between powerful families. Mercenary companies added another layer of danger to the medieval landscape. These professional warriors fought for whoever paid them best, switching sides frequently and showing loyalty only to money. When not employed in official campaigns, they often turned to banditry, extortion, and freelance warfare that terrorized civilian populations. The economic impact of constant warfare was devastating. Fields were burned, livestock slaughtered, and trade routes disrupted. Armies consumed enormous resources, food, weapons, horses, and other supplies that had to be taken from already struggling agricultural communities. Taxation to support military campaigns crushed peasant families who were already living on the edge of survival. Kings and nobles demanded extraordinary levies for their wars, forcing communities to choose between bankruptcy and rebellion. Many regions were completely impoverished by the cost of supporting their rulers' military ambitions. The human cost of medieval warfare was staggering. Battle casualties were enormous, as medieval combat was close-quarters fighting with edged weapons that caused horrible wounds. Medical care for wounded soldiers was minimal, so many who survived the initial fighting died slowly from infected wounds, blood loss, or disease. Civilian casualties were often even higher than military losses. Armies routinely murdered non-combatants, raped women, enslaved children, and destroyed entire communities. The passage of an army through a region could reduce thriving settlements to smoking ruins filled with corpses. The psychological drama of living in a world of constant warfare affected everyone in medieval society. Children grew up expecting violence, parents lived in fear of losing their families to war, and communities developed siege mentalities that made normal social and economic development impossible. Women faced particular horrors during wartime. Rape was so common that it was considered a normal part of military campaigns. Women and girls were routinely sexually assaulted by soldiers, and many were kidnapped and forced into sexual slavery. Pregnant women and new mothers received no special protection and were often targeted for particularly brutal treatment. The fortified castles and walled towns that dotted the medieval landscape were testimony to the constant threat of violence. These defensive structures required enormous resources to build and maintain, resources that could have been used to improve living conditions but instead had to be devoted to protection from human predators. Castle sieges could last for months or even years, creating conditions of extreme hardship for defenders and attackers alike. Starvation, disease, and psychological stress took their toll on everyone involved. When sieges finally ended, they often resulted in massacre and destruction that left regions depopulated for generations. The religious wars of the medieval period added ideological fanaticism to an already violent culture. Crusades were launched against Muslims, Jews, pagans, and Christian heretics, creating a culture where killing in God's name was not only acceptable but spiritually rewarding. The Crusades themselves were exercises in organized barbarity that devastated both Christian and Muslim territories. Crusading armies massacred entire populations, destroyed ancient cultural sites, and created lasting hatreds between religious communities that persist to this day. Even during periods of nominal peace, the threat of violence was never far away. Border raids, cattle rustling, kidnapping for ransom, and other forms of low-level warfare continued almost constantly. The feudal system's emphasis on personal honor and martial prowess meant that almost any insult or disagreement could escalate into armed conflict. The technology of medieval warfare evolved constantly as combatants sought new ways to kill their enemies more effectively. The introduction of crossbows, longbows, early firearms, and improved armor created an arms race that consumed enormous resources and led to ever more destructive conflicts. Naval warfare added another dimension of horror to medieval conflict. Ships were rammed, boarded, and burned with their crews still aboard. Pirates and naval raiders terrorized coastal communities, enslaving populations and destroying port cities. The lack of effective naval medicine meant that wounded sailors often died horrible deaths far from medical care. The end of wars rarely brought lasting peace, as victorious armies had to be demobilized and defeated populations had to be controlled. Former soldiers often turned to banditry when their military service ended, while conquered territories seethed with resentment that frequently erupted into new conflicts. Chapter 11. Conclusion: Why Modern Life is a Miracle. After this comprehensive journey through the horrors of medieval life, you should have a profound appreciation for the miraculous nature of modern existence. Every single aspect of your daily life, from the moment you wake up until you go to sleep, represents centuries of human progress that have lifted us out of the medieval nightmare and into a world of unprecedented safety, comfort, and opportunity. Consider your morning routine once more, but now with the full knowledge of what medieval people endured. You wake up in a bed with clean sheets, in a structurally sound building with reliable heating and cooling, protected by smoke detectors and sprinkler systems that would have seemed like divine intervention to medieval people whose homes regularly burned down around them. You flip a switch and electric lights instantly illuminate your room, no struggling with flint and steel, no rationing precious candles, no living in perpetual dimness that cause vitamin deficiencies and psychological disorders. The electricity flowing through your walls represents a mastery of natural forces that medieval people would have attributed to supernatural powers. You turn a handle and clean, safe water flows out at whatever temperature you desire, water that has been treated to remove the bacteria, parasites, and toxins that killed millions of our ancestors. The complex infrastructure of reservoirs, treatment plants, and distribution systems that makes this possible represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in public health. Your private bathroom, with its flush toilet and proper sewage disposal, eliminates the waste management nightmares that turned medieval cities into open sewers and breeding grounds for deadly diseases. The soap and shampoo you use routinely would have been luxury items beyond the reach of medieval royalty. You open a refrigerator stocked with fresh, safe food from around the world, fruits and vegetables available year-round, meat that has been properly inspected and refrigerated, dairy products that won't give you tuberculosis or brucellosis. The variety and safety of your food supply would seem like the magical abundance of heaven to people who lived with constant hunger and food poisoning. Your morning news, delivered instantly via television, radio, or internet, gives you more information about world events than medieval kings could gather about their own kingdoms. Your smartphone contains more computing power than entire medieval civilizations could have imagined, connecting you instantly to the accumulated knowledge of humanity and allowing you to communicate with people anywhere on Earth. The medical care available to you represents advances that would seem like miraculous healing to medieval people. Antibiotics can cure the infections that killed millions of our ancestors in agonizing deaths. Vaccines prevent the diseases that terrorized entire civilizations. Surgery can repair injuries and conditions that were automatic death sentences in medieval times. Even your basic first aid kit contains medical technology more advanced than anything available to medieval emperors. Your legal rights and protections exist in a different universe from medieval concepts of justice. You have the right to a fair trial with legal representation, protection from cruel and unusual punishment, due process of law, and presumption of innocence. You cannot be tortured to extract confessions, executed for minor thefts, or punished based on the accusations of more powerful people without evidence and proper legal proceedings. The social mobility available to you is unprecedented in human history. You can choose your own career path based on your interests and abilities rather than your birth circumstances. You can marry whom you love rather than accepting an arrangement made by your parents for political or economic reasons. You can live where you choose, travel freely, and determine your own future through your decisions and efforts. Women in modern society enjoy rights and freedoms that medieval women couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. You can own property, pursue education and careers, choose your own spouse or remain single, have control over your reproductive choices, and participate fully in political and economic life. The systematic oppression that defined women's lives for centuries has largely been swept away in the developed world. The food security you enjoy is almost incomprehensible from a medieval perspective. You have probably never experienced real hunger, never worried about starving to death, never eaten moldy bread because it was your only option. The variety, safety, and abundance of modern food would seem like an eternal feast to people who lived with constant food insecurity and the ever-present threat of famine. Transportation that seemed impossibly dangerous to our ancestors is now routine and remarkably safe. You can travel thousands of miles and hours with minimal risk of death, robbery, or getting lost. You can cross oceans in comfort and safety, communicate with people anywhere during your journey, and arrive at your destination with your health and wealth intact. The education available to you far exceeds what was available to medieval nobility and royalty. You can learn about any subject that interests you, develop skills that match your abilities, and acquire knowledge that gives you power over your own life and circumstances. The literacy that was reserved for a tiny elite is now considered a basic requirement for participation in modern society. Your work, however challenging it might sometimes seem, takes place in safe conditions with legal protections, reasonable hours, and compensation that allows you to live with dignity. You have workers' rights that protect you from exploitation, safety regulations that prevent industrial accidents, and the freedom to change jobs if you're dissatisfied with your current position. Even your leisure time represents a luxury that medieval people couldn't imagine. You have access to entertainment, education, travel, hobbies, and personal development opportunities that would have seemed like the privileges of gods to people who spent every waking moment struggling for survival. Your problems and challenges, real and significant as they may be, exist on a completely different level from the daily life or death struggles of medieval existence. You worry about career advancement, relationship issues, financial planning, and personal fulfillment concerns that assume a basic level of safety, security, and opportunity that our ancestors never experienced. The environmental quality of your life surpasses that of medieval royalty. You breathe air that isn't filled with smoke and toxins, drink water that won't kill you with dysentery, and live in spaces that aren't infested with vermin and parasites. The chronic diseases caused by medieval environmental conditions have largely disappeared from the developed world. Your life expectancy is more than double what it was in medieval times, and those extra decades are generally healthy, productive years rather than a prolonged decline into infirmity. You can expect to see your children grow up, meet your grandchildren, and enjoy a retirement that medieval people couldn't even conceive of. The security you enjoy, both physical and economic, allows you to plan for the future in ways that were impossible for our ancestors. You can save money, invest in education and skills, build a career over decades, and make long-term commitments because you live in a stable society with functioning institutions that protect your rights and property. Your individual worth and dignity are recognized and protected in ways that represent a fundamental revolution in human thinking. You have inherent rights that cannot be taken away by accidents of birth, gender, or social class. You are valued as a human being with your own thoughts, feelings, and aspirations, rather than as property or a unit of labor to be exploited by social superiors. The scientific knowledge that shapes your world has eliminated most of the ignorance and superstition that made medieval life so dangerous and unpredictable. You understand disease, weather, agriculture, physics, chemistry, and countless other phenomena that seem magical and terrifying to our ancestors who lacked basic scientific knowledge. The social safety nets available to you provide security that medieval people never had. Emergency services respond when you call for help. Medical care is available when you're sick or injured. Unemployment assistance exists if you lose your job. These systems aren't perfect, but they prevent the kind of catastrophic personal disasters that regularly destroyed medieval lives. Your freedom to think, speak, and believe what you choose represents centuries of struggle against the authoritarianism and religious oppression that characterized medieval society. You can question authority, express dissent, participate in governance, and live according to your own values without fear of execution, torture, or persecution. The diversity and tolerance of modern society allows people of different backgrounds, beliefs, and lifestyles to coexist peacefully. The religious conflicts, ethnic hatreds, and social prejudices that made medieval society so violent and oppressive have largely been overcome in developed nations, though vigilance is required to prevent their return. The technological tools available to you amplify human capabilities in ways that give you powers our ancestors would have attributed to divine intervention. You can communicate instantly across any distance, access information that would have taken medieval scholars lifetimes to gather, travel faster than the fastest medieval horse, and accomplish tasks that would have required armies of workers in the past. Your children have opportunities and protections that represent the hopes and dreams of countless generations of parents who couldn't provide such advantages. They can expect to live long, healthy, productive lives with educational opportunities, career choices, and personal freedoms that were unimaginable to medieval children who faced lives of predetermined servitude and struggle. So the next time you feel frustrated with modern life, remember where we came from. Remember the plague-infested hovels where entire families died in agony. Remember the contaminated food that caused constant illness and death. Remember the brutal legal systems that tortured and executed people for minor infractions. Remember the systematic oppression that crushed the hopes and dreams of billions of people throughout history. You've made it to the end. That means you survived this brutal journey through medieval life with us. If you found this dark tale enlightening, please consider subscribing to our channel, Lazy Historian, and give this video a thumbs up. I truly appreciate every one of you for watching and joining me on this journey through history's harsh realities. Remember, every comfort we enjoy today came from centuries of human struggle and progress.